Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. As you're here, make sure, just take a minute to share the video if you can on social media, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, become a patron if you appreciate the work that we're doing. Today, we have a conversation with Bryce Greene, who is an organizer and a writer based in Indiana. In this discussion, we will, talk about a recent piece that Bryce published that's called "Shielding U.S. Public from Israeli Reports of Friendly Fire on October 7th," from the outlet Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR.org. And we'll talk a little bit about that outlet too. I think it's an important outlet, one that we actually have not done, I don't think, anything on or with over the years, but I'll let Bryce explain a little bit about the work that they do, but it's a good one. And so anyways, I'm going to welcome Bryce to the stage. Bryce, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Right on. So why don't we start there and just say a little bit about the work that Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting does? And I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with it, but some may or may not, kind of understand the type of role that it plays, because obviously it's a journalism website, or a media website, but it has a specific purpose. It's not just like, a place that people go for news, but it's doing something a little bit different than that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and your own journalism and media work, which I know much of it is on there, but you also have other work that you do as well.
Right. So I think for anyone critical of the current state of affairs, of the current capitalist world order, or our government, or what have you, you learn pretty quickly that one of the most important influences in shaping public opinion, shaping elite opinion, is what gets talked about in the mainstream media. What gets discussed on the pages of the New York Times, on CNN, on the Washington Post, all of that has a dramatic effect on what the public discourse is. And if you've gone back in history and looked at some of the, the worst events, the worst excesses of American empire, the Latin American terror wars, Vietnam, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, you learn pretty quickly that the media plays a critical role in, I'm sure you all know the term, manufacturing consent for what American policy is. And so, what Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting has tried to do since the late '90s is to provide an outlet where people who are critical of mainstream narratives are able to put forth articles that rebut these mainstream accounts, stories, and again narratives. And so, Fair produces a lot of articles that focus on media coverage of specific events, of specific narratives that are common in the mainstream, and it goes through and criticizes them. Now, it can criticize it in many ways. It can point out obvious falsehoods, journalistic malpractice. It can point out the underlying assumptions within a piece that aren't stated but are essential to understanding it. And they also publish pieces that review uh, media about media, so to speak. Some of the more interesting things I think on the site are reporting on different reports about large scale media analysis. And so I got into fair during the latter years of my college career, my undergraduate career. Every leftist goes on a journey where they're trying to find alternative media, and they're trying to situate themselves in the conversation. And Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting was one of those sites that came up on in some leftist forums repeatedly, and I saw that the work that they did was very close to what I really wanted to be doing. You get to watch this process of history being rewritten in real time, and I think documenting that is essential. And so, even when I was still an undergrad, I think the last semester of my senior year, I sent in my first piece to Fair. It was about an article. It was about Venezuela, I believe, and it was a New York Times article about their healthcare system, and they used a bunch of sources that were close to the U.S. establishment, and they omitted the crucial role of U.S. sanctions in bringing the Venezuelan economy to its knees. And I was seeing this article, and I was like, well, that's nonsense. And there's a place where people can discuss these things. There's a place where I can, publish my first real piece of writing. And so I sent it into the editors, and they said it was good, and they published it. And since then, I've just been observing the media and publishing when I can, on top of organizing and doing school and doing all the other life stuff to do. So it's been a good journey. There are a good bunch of people at Fair. I think your listeners, if you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. And you should also donate, because independent media doesn't subsist on its own, and they're not getting grants from billionaires. And so it's really subscriber and supporter driven.
Right on. That's great. So we're here to talk about a piece that you wrote, shielding U.S. public from Israeli reports of friendly fire on October 7th. I think many of our viewers probably are somewhat familiar with some of the aspects of what you kind of cover in this piece, but I don't want to assume that, because I know people will just be scrolling YouTube and happen upon this conversation too. And for folks who know, we some of your you look at things that are reported in like Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss, which are outlets with folks that we've had conversations on this platform, and so there may be some familiarity there. But you talk a little bit about some of the aspects of October 7th that Israeli media has discussed that have not been discussed in English language outlets, or only through kind of independent outlets. Yeah.
All right. Well, one of the big things that gets discussed in the Israeli press, well, one of the interesting things to note about the Israeli press in general is that even though they have overt military censorship, like if you publish an article in a news outlet, like it goes through the military censors. But even despite that, they're a lot more honest about what goes on in their country than American papers are. You can get a less ideological view of Israel in the pages of Haaretz than in the pages of the New York Times. And that's just one of those peculiarities. People can speculate as to the historical circumstances that actually led to that. But the end result is that if you want to know what's going on in Israel, you can trust the Israeli press a lot more than the American press. And one of the things that they've covered a great deal since the war started is the instances of friendly fire, uh, or the instances of the Israeli defense services, the Israeli defense forces, killing civilians on that day. The original narrative that people were fed on October 7th was that thousands of lunatic terrorists spilled over into over the border, the Gaza border, and went into these border towns, raped, killed, and pillaged as many people as they could, kidnapped some, and that's the story. But the actual narrative that's emerging based on the Israeli press is a little bit more complicated than that. These stories talk about the response of the Israeli military on that day and the use of what's called the Hannibal Directive. Now, the Hannibal Directive has been a policy of the Israeli government and military to use overwhelming force to prevent any hostages or any POWs from being taken, even to the point where it threatens the life of the prisoner of war. They're willing to kill their own prisoners to ensure that the Palestinians don't have any bargaining power over the Israeli government. In the past, there have been prisoner swaps in which POWs have POWs held by the Palestinians have been traded for POWs held by the Israelis. And this has been, a tactic in many wars, but it's especially been seen in the conflict between Gaza and Israel. And so this Hannibal Directive is really meant to prevent them from getting that sort of advantage. And so after the initial reports on October 7th, little bits started to drip out in the Israeli press. One of the first things that came out was the testimony of a woman named Yasmin Porat, who was at Kibbutz Be'eri. And she described, one of these instances in which the Israeli military used overwhelming force, killing both militants and the people that they were holding captive, which was a microcosm into a larger implementation of the Hannibal Directive. And so there have been more and more reports coming out of Israeli press, and it's not fringe Israeli papers. Again, these are going through military censorship. Papers like Aretz, papers like Ynet, they have been reporting on these events, mainly in Kibbutz Be'eri, but also in other places, about these instances of friendly fire. And so the importance of these instances are that it complicates the narrative of just a simple, terrorist attack designed to kill as many civilians as possible. What it shows is that on that day, initially we were told that there were 1,400 people who were killed, but that number was later revised down to 1,200, and it was for an interesting reason, admitted to by the Israeli spokespeople, was that these bodies were burned up so bad beyond recognition that that Israeli first responders initially thought that these might have been Israelis who were killed, but they turned out to be Palestinians after further examination. But it raised the question: why is it that there were 200 people who were burned beyond recognition, and the first assumption was that they were Israelis? If you couldn't tell, doesn't that speak volumes about the level of seriousness of your prior investigations, of the prior reporting into who was killed? And so the numbers continue to be in question. They've been revised down again since then, to the point where I believe the total is just over 1,100 people were killed that day. But this doesn't separate out the civilians who were killed, as many scholars and researchers have pointed out over time that Palestinians do have the right to militarily resist their oppressors. This doesn't mean that they have the right to kill civilians, but it means that it's important to distinguish between attacks on civilians and attacks on military. The Israeli press and the Israeli spokespeople and the conversation in America doesn't seem to distinguish that. But based on the latest numbers from RS, who is the best source keeping track of this, it seems that a sizable chunk, up to around 40% of the casualties on that day, were military or security force casualties. The rest being civilians, and so e- the number of civilians who were actually killed by Hamas is has not been confirmed, has not been adjudicated, has not been investigated by any source. But these pieces that I'm talking about in the Israeli press about these friendly fire, what it does is that it shows that there is a sizable body of evidence that shows that many of these civilians were killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. One of the most important pieces that's come out on this was from Ynet, the English language name of the paper. I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's a Yehodiot Aronot, I believe. Um, but they published an article confirming that this Hannibal Directive, or at least a version of it, was implemented that day. But it also confirmed that Apache helicopter fire was responsible for many of the destroyed vehicles that were displayed as part of the public relations campaign in the early days of the war. I'm sure your viewers remember the images of these burnt out cars and these twisted metal and these charred bodies. There were initial questions as to, well, does Hamas have the technology that could create that damage? Those questions seem to be answered in this Ynet piece, which said that at least 70 vehicles on their making their way back to Gaza with hostages in them were blown up by the Israeli military. Just straight up blown up without regard for whether or not civilians were in there. And so again, we have these reports making it through military censorship, showing that the Israeli Defense Forces killed many of their civilians. And we know that the Israeli government has fabricated evidence and is willing to straight up lie about atrocities in order to generate support for their actions. And so, combining those two things, we should be very skeptical about anyone who claims to know exactly what happened on October 7th. And we should be doubly skeptical for anyone trying to use those claims to justify, uh, any sort of action, especially the brutal genocidal actions that are taking place in the Gaza Strip right now. And so I think that it really calls into question the integrity of our media system, our politicians, and just the information space that we currently inhabit. I think these reports show that sometimes the American press, as is often the case, especially in foreign policy, isn't acting in the best interests of the people. They're acting in the best interests of state and corporate and military elites, and so they want to manufacture consent for U.S. support for Israeli actions. But in order to do that, they can't report the whole truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you're talking about that too, I'm conscious that just, as we woke up this morning, there's reports of hundreds of people. I mean, at least 100 people that were killed, and I think thousands that were well, many, many that were injured. We don't know full numbers yet that were injured today as they were trying to get aid in Gaza, and Israel opened fire on people, seeking to just get food and things like that, right? And so, um, again, I mean, don't know all the details of that, but it's an atrocity that one would think would, you know, also warrant a great deal of investigation and skepticism, and but we don't see that kind of lens being pointed at the actions of the Israeli government right now, just on the actions of Palestinians. Um so
No, you're exactly right.
um yeah so one thing, so one thing that's interesting, aspect of this piece is that, there was this recent Washington Post article, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think this is one of the only areas that you found, or maybe the only place in the found in sort of dominant mainstream press, where there's kind of been any engagement with the idea of sort of what happened on October 7th. And it was to, basically, talk about this concept of October 7th truthers. So say a little bit about, what you found in this piece, and kind of some of the aspects that you looked at with regard to, this Washington Post story.
Yeah, I mentioned that the American media can't show you what's really going on. Otherwise, they'll be failing in their job to manufacture consent. We at Fair we found a few instances in the New York Times where it was mentioned that orders were given to disregard civilians, but it wasn't really emphasized. It was one of those things that's buried in the 10th paragraph and not given any analysis or attention. But it's a pretty serious event. But the only paper or the only instance where we found that really went into this in any depth was the Washington Post in their story about, again, trying to accuse people of being truthers. Um, so this Post article, we had known that it was coming for some time. Ali Abu Nima, the head of Electronic Intifada, had said that he was contacted by a New York Times reporter. And I don't recall the exact message that was sent, but it made it clear that the reporter was not going to be seriously considering the evidence that was presented in the reports from Electronic Intifada and the Gray Zone. And so when this piece came out, no one was really surprised that it largely served as a hit piece against independent reporters. What they ended up doing was they tried to situate the journalistic outlets like Electronic Intifada and Gray Zone in the context of all these other cranks on the internet, um, who might have grand ideas about grand narratives about how October 7th happened. And so the Post did a sleight of hand that it's very easy to notice if you've been reading critical literature on the press, but maybe for the average reader it might not have been so obvious. What they did was they looked at interviewed one woman who was part of a Telegram group that had 3,000 people in it, and this one woman said that yeah, she might have believed that October 7th was a false flag. Okay. And then they looked at a woman who was at a protest who said something similar. And then they looked at a post on r/ late stage capitalism, where someone said that it was a false flag. And then they said that this is just an example of a growing group of people who are engaging in denialism about October 7th. And then they went on to say that some of this is promoted by news outlets like Electronic Intifada and Gray Zone. And the Post went on to be extremely dishonest in their reporting. They didn't link to anything the Gray Zone put out. They didn't link to anything the Electronic Intifada put out. But Electronic Intifada has been one of the only outlets in the English language press who's been translating some of these Israeli language, these Hebrew language articles, who's been reporting and recounting these stories to American audiences. And so the Gray Zone as well, and throw in Mondo Weiss for their excellent work. But the Post focused on EI and the Gray Zone. What they did was they said that the reporting distorted what was actually said by these outlets, by these Israeli outlets. And again, mind you, they didn't actually link to them. They didn't actually quote them at any length, but they made it appear that it was so obvious that these pieces were distorted that they shouldn't even be considered. And it really seemed like they were the only outlet that brought attention to these allegations. Were only bringing attention to them uh, for the purpose of dismissing them and uh, making them seem stigmatized or untrue or beyond the pale. And they continue to go through both misquote Electronic Intifada on multiple occasions. They accused Asa Winstanley, one of the editors at EI, they accused him of saying that most civilians on October 7th were killed by the Israelis. However, Winstanley was very clear to say that many, if not most, which is obviously a completely different statement, because the Washington Post obviously knew this and they read it, and so they deliberately misquoted him. They also misquoted him on some other minor stuff. They said that one of his stories was based on a YouTube interview with a guy who claimed to be an Israeli official, when in reality, the article in question was based on several different reports from the Israeli press. It was based on several different interviews that were pulled from multiple sources. And the guy didn't just claim to be an Israeli military official. He actually was, and it was pretty obvious that he was. But again, the Washington Post simply decided that this was beyond the pale and that it could be dismissed without giving the readers any bit of evidence. And so that was just one egregious example. The other one was, of course, them covering Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone and his report on what happened on October 7th and the friendly fire incidents. Blumenthal has done great work on this, and the Gray Zone has done great work on this. But the Washington Post decided to say that he distorted the testimony of Apache helicopter pilots who were firing at people on the ground. Blumenthal reported that some of these helicopter pilots had reported that they could not tell between terrorists and civilians, and that they unleashed a massive amount of firepower on Israel proper, like within Israel's border. That they emptied their ammo. They used all of it up. So each of these reports was based on, again, reports in Israeli media, and they were not misquoted in the slightest. But the problem was that, or at least to Max Blumenthal's critics, was that he didn't adequately justify the actions of these helicopter pilots because he didn't talk about all the things that the terrorists were doing. And so they said that while Blumenthal reported that they couldn't distinguish between civilians and militants, he didn't point out that the militants were being so evil and terroristic, and that the reason that they were firing so much was to kill the terrorists. It was a pretty weak attack on Blumenthal's reporting, and but this was cited by the Post as a legitimate criticism. And I think the most egregious part of the Washington Post reporting was the connection between criticizing the official narratives on October 7th and labeling the people who do so Holocaust deniers. A sizable chunk of the Washington Post report focused on talking to so-called experts about the continuity between Holocaust denial and October 7th denial, as they call it. What they're doing is they're equating people who question the Holocaust, which is something that has been researched and substantiated with volumes and volumes, hundreds of thousands of pages of research, with October 7th, for which the only official investigation to have ever happened into 10/7 comes from the Israeli government. And as I've said, and as I'm sure your viewers and listeners know, the Israeli government has certainly uh, lost any credibility when it comes to any grand claims that are justifying its actions. This doesn't just go back to October 7th. This goes back, decades and decades. But if only the Israeli government has investigated it, and if they're preventing future investigations, and if the party they're accusing of massive war crimes has actually agreed to investigations, then maybe it should raise questions about whether or not they should be trusted, or whether or not that their account of events should be definitive. And I think that that is a very open question. And so this linking between Holocaust denial and October 7th questioning is just pure propaganda. It's designed to stop people from thinking. It's designed to make people think twice before they talk about what really happened on October 7th. I'm on a university campus, and I feel that exact pressure. If you go to somebody, if you go to a professor or whoever and talk about October 7th, well, most of them have no idea that these counter narratives exist. Most of them are just closely following the New York Times. They're just closely following CNN. Maybe they'll turn on Al Jazeera English, but most of them are completely unaware of the realities. And you get strange looks if you even say that, hey, I want to talk about this. I think this is important or worth discussing. People are like, well, maybe stay away from that for the good of your career, or don't rock the boat too much. It's a hot button issue. Well, that's how successful propaganda campaigns work. You couldn't talk about it, and until it's too late. Maybe in a year or two, there'll be an opportunity for people to be more honest about it. But who knows how many Palestinians will have been massacred by then?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's like one of the things that um, I think is important about your piece is also illustrating that Israeli people who, in some cases, are the family members of people who were kidnapped or taken, on October 7th, etc. That many of them have been ones who have actually asked for investigations, who have actually wanted to get to the bottom of what exactly went on, or people who lost family members, right, as a result of that day. Um, and so, I think it's quite amazing to have the United States press, you know, say that this is beyond the pale when everything else that they're doing is sort of like focused on, well, we need to return the hostages, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's a great part of the narrative within the West, and yet there's not this even engagement with um, the requests for investigations that are coming from within Israeli society, which obviously are not being listened to by the Israeli government, which is a source of tension within their society as well at this point. But again, it's like, are they Holocaust deniers, right? I mean, that kind of logic just seems really egregious when you start to dig into this even a little bit.
Right. One of the things that isn't discussed in the American media ecosystem is just how up in arms the hostages' families are against the Netanyahu government for their obvious disregard for the hostages. Now, again, you'll see all these people talk about, oh, we got to return the hostages. Oh, we got to bring the people home. But I mean, even Netanyahu has been clear, at least very recently, that even if a hostage deal was released, the IDF is still going to go into Rafah, where all these refugees are languishing and being bombed and being shot at. Mm, Even if the hostages are released, Netanyahu is saying that they're going to mount a full-scale military invasion into that area, which that seems to tell you just how much they care about the hostages, just how big of a priority these hostages are to the Israeli military, but also it shows on another level how disdainful they are of any sort of negotiation. There's been a lot of ceasefire propaganda going back and forth. The New York Times just reported that Hamas rejects a ceasefire offer. And again, that's all designed to manufacture consent for the upcoming assault on Rafah. Hamas didn't reject a ceasefire offer in any real sense. What they rejected was the idea that fighting will continue after a brief pause. They said that they want a permanent ceasefire and a lifting of the blockade, something incidentally they've been asking for since October 9th, but Israel has continuously refused it. And so every so often, Israel will offer a temporary truce, Hamas will reject it. Israel will get their headline that says Hamas rejects a truce. But every time Israel rejects the offer for a permanent ceasefire, well, that's not reported as Israel rejecting a truce offer. Well, maybe sometimes it is, but that's always framed as we don't negotiate with terrorists. We still have to get our hostages back. There, you can't leave Hamas in power, and all of these tropes contribute to this propaganda climate in which Israel can do no wrong, and if it does, it's only because they care about their people so much that they have to defend themselves. It's nonsense. But over in Israel, the hostages' families they've been very critical of the government. In fact, some hostages who actually spent time in Gaza, who were released as part of these earlier hostage deals, they've actually said that they were terrified not of Hamas, but they were terrified that they were going to be killed by the Israeli bombs that were falling. And again, it undermines the stated justification for the bombing to bring back the hostages, to dismantle, Hamas network so that this will never happen again. When you might be killing the hostages. There are unconfirmed reports that many hostages have already been killed in this bombardment. But B, it also clearly will only incite more violence in the future. If someone lost their entire family because Israel dropped the bomb on them, well, they're not going to turn against Hamas. They're going to turn against the guys who dropped the bombs. This is known by anyone with the brain. This is known by the Israelis. This is known by the Mossad, the Shin Bet. They understand this dynamic, but they simply think that the American people are stupid and they don't understand this, or at the very least, they think that even if they do realize that it's a lie, they won't be able to do anything about it. And whether or not that's true depends on, of course, activists on the ground, whether or not that they can pierce through the fog of nonsense and bullshit and, form a coherent view of the world and take steps to change it. And I think we're seeing that now with this massive mobilization in different sectors of our society, and it's giving me a lot of hope. And it's one of the only ways I can stay sane throughout this whole thing is organizing.
Yeah, right on. Appreciate that. Appreciate the call from journalists to organize too, right? So one thing that your piece doesn't, go into specifically, but is really, I think, in recent weeks, I mean, has always been some, questioning of this narrative, but it seems to be really kind of unraveling at this point. That there's sort of a lack of English language critical reporting around the allegations of mass rape, right? And so, this is also obviously been a key part of the justification that has been given, around such a brutal genocidal war on Palestinians. And yet there's not many outlets that have sought to investigate this, look at the people who are reporting it, look at the people who are the sources, look at where does this narrative actually have its factual kind of basis. And we've seen some important people who have been involved in it either recant their testimony or their role in it. The New York Times obviously did a big story on it, but then they were supposed to do a podcast related to that story, and there was reporting that some of the reporters weren't comfortable doing that. They didn't feel comfortable enough with the story, and so that episode didn't air. Um, and again, like the sourcing of it is linked to some kind of circumstantial evidence and a small group of kind of people and sources that often have connections to either the Israeli government or military, or have been shown to be sort of liking on social media very extreme, views around promoting ethnic cleansing or genocide of Palestinians. So, it's not something that you go into in your piece. I think folks, there's a link to the piece in the episode. I definitely encourage everybody to read it because I think it's really great reporting that you've done there. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts or coverage on this aspect and kind of the lack of critical engagement around this as well.
Right. This has been one of the main pillars, the propaganda pillars on which Operation Iron Swords is built on. The idea that they were, or the Hamas and Palestinian militants were slaughtering as many people as possible, and that they had a truce on October 6th, but they broke it, and they did it so they could mass rape Israeli women. And that has been part of the narrative for it's on CNN. You saw it on New York Times. You see it repeated everywhere ad nauseum. Zionists will yell at you that rape is not resistance. But the sourcing on this is very questionable. And it's interesting you should mention the New York Times piece. About 12 hours ago, before I went to bed, The Intercept reported a very in-depth article about the process that led to the New York Times article. Um, but it seems that the biggest push in the media to promote these mass rape narratives came after the end of the first hostage deal. A lot of people, remember the Super Bowl timed bombing, but fewer people remember the timed stories of mass rape in American media and in the Israeli press that came right after the truce ended. Well, the truce ended, and the Israelis were the first to drop the bombs. So they, of course, needed a way to justify it to, again, the American audiences who, even at that time, were growing a little weary of the genocide. And so these articles started coming out saying that, these people heard these women being raped, or these people were first responders and they got onto the scene and they saw signs of rape. But it became pretty clear that these sources were not as solid as Western media would make them out to be. My reporting on this actually only comes in the form of close reading of articles on Twitter. A full fledged, like written write up of this would be very long indeed, and I'm sure there are good people working on it, and there are people who have done good work on this front at the Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss especially. But some of these reports relied on these first responder groups, and like Zaka. And Zaka, incidentally, was one of the groups that promoted this idea that Hamas was beheading babies, and that they found babies in the oven, and that they found, pregnant women whose babies had been removed and burned and brutally mutilated. All of these narratives that were essential in manufacturing consent for the early stages of the war, but later turned out to be false. Even the Israeli paper Aretz published a long, in-depth article about how these first responders were very inaccurate and they had to walk back a lot of their claims. But in this new round of these sexual assault allegations, these mass assault allegations, these Zaka guys were treated as completely viable sources. They were treated as credible first responders who have an impeccable record, even though nothing that they said was backed up by physical evidence. They were treated as serious in the American press. Now, incidentally, the Israeli press had published an article saying that police were unable to match these vivid descriptions of mutilation, of torture, of sexual violence to any of the bodies that they were able to recover, which, in my mind, seems to discredit them entirely, given the length of time that first responders or examiners have had to go over these bodies. But these narratives persisted regardless, and the big boost came from the uh, uh, publishing of. There were several reports done by different Israeli organizations, and what I did was I looked at the main story in Aretz about these reports, about the people who were supposed to be investigating it. And what I called this article was an example of epistemological warfare. This article was mainly focused on explaining why there was no evidence and being exasperated that anyone would even ask for evidence, saying that that's disrespectful and it's, it's you don't do that. You can't ask me for for evidence of violence. and it was seen as so. Uh, I've never seen an investigator that was so resistant to the idea that they're supposed to be collecting evidence. And in fact, this woman, she said that explicitly her job is not to collect evidence. Um, and if you look through the rest of the articles that talk about these reports, you'll notice that a lot of them will say that to this day, no victim has come forth claiming to have been raped. Not a single one. There have been people who claim to have witnessed rape. There have been first responders who say they have seen signs of rape. But there have been no victims who have claimed that they have been raped, which I think is a pretty significant point in these allegations. Now, the next boost to that narrative came in the form of a New York Times story where they covered the woman in the black dress. And I'm sure many people remember that image of the woman in the black dress, who half her body was charred. She was there with her legs spread open after something happened to that at that moment. But the New York Times went through and they said definitively that this was evidence of rape. But it later came out that the family of this woman had never seen any evidence of rape, and they actually objected to the way the New York Times characterized what was in that report. And again, you have one of these pillars of propaganda being dismantled. Now, the Intercept article that I talked about that was just released, I've only read through it once, and so I don't have a complete command of all the facts in that article. But the interesting thing that stuck out to me was that a lot of it centered on the fact that one of the journalists, these journalists had very little journalistic experience, and the New York Times seemed to push them into reporting on these sexual assault allegations. That's one important aspect. But another important aspect is that this journalist, while she was recounting her story of her investigation, she repeatedly pointed out that she called up all the clinics in Israel, and not a single one had said that they found an example of rape. She called some of the people who had been making these allegations, but she was unable to find any forensic evidence that backed up those claims. And time again, when she was unable to find this evidence, she would simply rely on the IDF or sources provided to her by the IDF or some of these first responders organizations that had been shown to be spreading blatant atrocity propaganda. And what's worse is that this woman seems to have interacted with social media posts that are uh, supportive of the Israeli campaign. So, taken all together, you have the New York Times pushing inexperienced reporters to report on some of the most important parts of this current war. This person did not easily find any evidence to back up the most lurid of claims, and this person clearly seems to be sympathetic to the Israeli government. And in fact, the Intercept reported that she was torn between her role as a journalist and her role as someone who's in favor of Israel, who's pro-Israel. But people were encouraging her to put out this story, saying that it was very important to the Israeli public relations effort in the war. And so it really doesn't get worse than that. You have the New York Times, the paper of record, blatantly manipulating stories in order to promote the propaganda line of a lunatic genocidal country that's currently engaging in one of the worst mass killings in the 21st century. It's pretty remarkable to and difficult to wrap your head around, but that's what the reality is.
Yeah, appreciate that breakdown. I did put a link for folks to that article in the chat from the Intercept as well. And the thing I would say too, is I can't remember. I wish I remember who said this online, but it's a great point. Um, that most journalists wait their whole life or hope that someday they would be able to get a byline in the New York Times, and to be able to do it with no journalistic experience, folks should really question how and why someone gets that sort of opportunity, and it because it doesn't happen where people's first byline just shows up in the New York Times. I mean, that's a highly questionable thing in itself. So Folks, if you do have questions, I have one more that I'm going to ask Bryce here, but feel free to drop some in the comments and I will, or in the chat, and I will pull them up. Um, Thanks for all of this discussion today. So one of the things I also wanted to do is just offer a little bit of space to talk about some of the other issues that you've reported on over the years, because I think you do some really important and interesting work on just areas, as we've said, where there's a lack of critical engagement, a lack of investigation. And I imagine that, I know you've done several on FAIR. I think you also have a Substack. But one of the particular issues I noticed that you've covered is the Nordstream pipeline sabotage, which again is a very big story that didn't receive much critical engagement at all within US media. Obviously, Seymour Hersh did some Substack reporting, but commented a lot on how nobody wanted to do anything with his story. So, can you say a little bit about your own examination of that, and what are some of the key things you've taken away from that story a couple of years later?
All right. The Nord Stream pipeline is an interesting case. I was first put onto the pipeline when there was some tension about whether or not it would be completed as a result of the uh, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I guess this 2 years ago now. But it really came to a head in the fall of that same year when the pipeline mysteriously exploded. Now, when the pipeline exploded, it was pretty clear that it was deliberate. Seismic readings from Swedish researchers pretty much showed that this was not a result of some natural oceanic current or underground shifting or whatever. It was targeted explosions at these different locations. And the Nord Stream pipeline is important because it's a pipeline that moves Russian natural gas, liquid natural gas, to Europe. Nord Stream 1 was the first pipeline that did this. Nord Stream 2 was supposed to expand the capacity of that pipeline dramatically, giving cheap energy to Germany and other places. And so the Americans have long been opposed to this pipeline because they believe that it would decrease European energy independence. What that means is that if they're more dependent on Russia, then they're more likely to have friendlier relations with Russia, which undermines the U.S. national project of imperial competition. Um, and so when these pipelines were exploded, it was very interesting to see everyone in the Western press immediately blame Russia. Now, this pipeline went from Russia to Germany. It was a Russian pipeline. They spent billions of dollars to uh, complete this project. So the idea that they would blow up their own pipeline seems to be strange. You would need a very good reason, a very good sequence of events to make that case credible. But the American media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, they pointed out pretty quickly that there doesn't appear to be a clear reason for Russia to have blown up his own pipeline. But they speculated that it might just be a way to intimidate the West, which is, it's like blowing up my own hand to intimidate my enemy. It doesn't make much sense. But that's what grown adults in the Western media were saying. um, but it became pretty obvious that this was just nonsense. The person with the groups with the most motive to destroy the pipeline was, of course, the West, the United States, Ukraine, and some others. Uh, and so this went. I published this article on Fair, mainly pointing out these discrepancies. Almost unanimously in the Western media, they would blame Russia, and the people who didn't blame Russia, like Tucker Carlson, who he's no friend to the left. If that's not clear to anybody by now, he's no friend to the left. He's no friend to anti-imperialists. But his reporting of the Nord Stream pipeline accurately pointed out the motivations for its destruction. Accurately pointed out that Biden had actually said before the pipeline was destroyed, he said that we will find a way to stop it. And same with other members of his administration. But when Carlson reported this, the Washington Post called him a conspiracy theorist, and they put his name in the Cyrillic alphabet and printed that and said he was a Russian spy or blah, blah, blah. But they weren't able to deal with the substantive claims there. Now, after that period, Seymour Hersh released a report in his own Substack alleging that the United States blew up the pipeline that it was U.S. divers who did this, and that it was ordered by Joe Biden. Now, Seymour Hersh is a world-renowned reporter. I don't think that he's unimpeachable. Some people do, but I have found problems with his reporting in the past. And it's not unforgivable. Journalism's hard, and when you're dealing with spooky sources, it's especially difficult to suss out fact from fiction. But the Hersh report was interesting because, again, you have this world-renowned, deeply connected journalist uh, confirming what many people had suspected. And but that, of course, was ignored in the Western press. The later it became a major story that it might have been Ukrainian individuals or Ukraine supporting individuals. I can't remember the exact term, but Western media was very careful not to finger Zelensky himself in this, but they reported that Ukrainians were behind the sabotage. And so this was something that was given more attention in the Western press. Seymour Hersh, for his part, reported that the Ukraine did it story was a deliberate attempt to uh, distract viewers from his own reporting. But in either case, the Western media seemed to admit that the West was behind this. Ukraine, of course, was a NATO proxy member who was fighting a proxy war on behalf of the United States and others. If they did it, the only reason they could have done it or would have done it would be with U.S. sanction. Um, and so, but that parlor game about whether or not the U.S. And Ukraine did it, went on for a while. But I eventually was invited to speak at the United Nations on this topic. I was invited by the Russian Federation mostly because they were looking to start a Security Council investigation into these events. Uh, of course, I should note that I was not paid for my services or compensated in any way. I still maintain my independence, and there was nothing. Uh, there was no influence on my statements there. But what I said at the UN was whether or not the U.S. did it or Ukraine did it is a moot point. Uh, National security journalist James Banford had reported in The Nation that the U.S. has the Balkans wired up, or the Baltics wired up to high heaven, and they had acoustic sensors that could determine which ships were where, and especially on that day of the explosion. They had every bit of knowledge they needed to determine who did it, but they kept this information from investigators and from the press. And so, if Ukraine did it, it means that they had the backing of the U.S., either tacit or direct. And if the U.S. did it, well, then it means that the U.S. did it. So, in both of those scenarios, which are the only ones that are taken seriously in the Western press at this moment, they both point to the United States as being a central actor in this. And I think that based on that information, the details about whether or not what was the nationality of the divers was far less important to me. So I think this is a very consequential story because we've seen reports over the last year or so since the explosion of the pipeline about Germany's quote deindustrialization. That's a pretty heavy term, but it's being used by the mainstream economic press, like The Economist, Business Insider, others, to describe what's happening to the German economy. The Nordstream Pipeline provided cheap gas to Germany. Cheap gas means your industrial sector is able to produce things at a cheaper rate, increasing the price of that natural gas, which, by the way, since they could no longer get gas from the Nord Stream pipeline, they had to turn to American companies to get natural gas at far higher prices and far higher transport costs. Well, that rose the cost of doing business in Germany, and industry couldn't keep up. And so, over the last year or so, we've been seeing headlines about Germany's industrial base being decimated. And that's largely, in part, a result of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline and the accompanying geopolitics. So this is another example in which you had an event, then you had an initial propaganda campaign designed to muddy the waters on this event, and then you had real serious reporting coming out after the fact, long after the discussion had been cemented in people's minds. So again, FAIR and some of the work I do tries to capture this process of rewriting history and reshaping history for propaganda purposes. Who knows? Maybe in a few years, or a few decades, I'm going to read in a history book about how Russia blew up its own pipeline to intimidate the West. Uh, I'm going to be very upset if that happens. But the work we do at FAIR is sort of aimed at ensuring that that doesn't happen.
Right on. I appreciate that. So I have one question here from an audience member. Folks, again, if you have other ones, feel free to drop them in, and then I'll have one other one that I'll ask you. But so how do we turn attention to the intentional lies the media is spewing? Um, yeah. So and maybe we can connect this actually to my question, which was a little bit maybe about your. I mean, you can talk about the work that FAIR does in that respect, but I think also, organizing is a component of this as well. And so maybe you could say a little bit about some of the organizing that you've been involved in.
Yeah. So the lies of the media. I mean, if you focus too much on it, it will make you go crazy. I mean, if you turn on CNN and you hear Anderson Cooper talk about how there's been so much violence on both sides. Meanwhile, the last time an Israeli civilian was killed, uh, they were killed by Israel, and it was months ago. But that's just one of the many little examples that make up the broader picture of the big lie that Israel is somehow a victim in all this. Uh, I think the way to handle it is if you are a critical media viewer, you probably don't need to be watching this mainstream press much. You probably do not need to be watching CNN. You don't need to be reading the New York Times unless there's like a special story. You don't need to be uh, following all these idiot commentators who are very clearly just pro-Israel Hasbara shills. It will make you like lose your mind. I do it because it's part of my job, but I'm also currently losing my mind. And so I think the best thing you can do is turn to the people around you. They're political actors to some degree. They vote, they have opinions, they tweet, they post, they have ideas. I think these conversations are best had with people people you can discuss things with in good faith and try and get the truth. Because the truth is out there. It's difficult to wade through all these articles, all these comments, all these accounts, and piece them together, suss out fact from fiction. It's difficult to do that, but once you do it one time, it becomes easier to identify these patterns. It becomes easier to inoculate yourself and the people around you from massive propaganda campaigns. And so I think that that's what the focus should be on. Now, in terms of organizing, I think that's where the real focus should be on. You, like I said earlier, the only way I'm able to stay semi sane in this is by knowing that I'm taking some action beyond just posting, beyond just talking to audiences about what's going on, taking actions that might actually have an effect on how this whole situation turns out in the future. I'm a student. I go to Indiana University. I'm a graduate student there, and I work with the Graduate Workers Union. And as an undergrad here, I also helped co-found the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which to this day is still going strong. And we do work bringing speakers, educating students, the direct action against military industrial complex people when they come to campus, direct action against the university for their investments and their affiliations with Israeli apartheid. I think that's a very useful thing to do. And I tell some of the students we organize with that you might not see the fruits of your labor today, tomorrow, in a year, even in 10 years. But whenever a crisis like uh, this ongoing genocide happens, uh, how it turns out depends on the balance of power of the forces in your country. And don't you wish that people had been spending uh, time organizing these massive institutions before October 7th? Don't you wish that there could be organized resistance before all this stuff happened? Well, if you're able to, look ahead, you understand that the work you do is that foundation that will be used in any future power struggles. I tell them this phase of the war will end. This genocide phase will end, and there will be some solution that'll be either temporary or permanent. But what that solution looks like will be determined by the balance of power in America, especially. And what you can do now to affect that in the future is to organize, to build institutions that will persist, to build a foundation that can be used for future work. It's no big secret how to change the world. It's been, we all know it's pretty straightforward. Link up with like minded individuals, organize, do something, exercise power, and there are always opportunities that exist. And so you just need to be vigilant and exploit them when you can.
Much appreciated. I'll just lift up this chat, this comment, of how it can feel crazy also to talk to people in real life who have bought the propaganda hook, line, and sinker, and just say that I think that's a great, the role of reporting like this article you've written for FAIR and other folks who are doing that kind of work is essential in being able to kind of have places that you can have conversations about these things, that you can point these things out, and doing what we're doing today, right? We come on and we discuss it, we go through the details of it. And so, yeah, Bryce, I just want to thank you for joining us. I'm sure that we'll be inviting you on again to talk about work that you're doing in the future. I much appreciate it. And for folks who missed it, make sure to go back and check out the beginning of the conversation. Really appreciated having you on and having this discussion.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to coming back.
One last thing I should say is, so are there ways that folks, you have a Substack? I mean, are there ways people could support your work? Or you also mentioned supporting FAIR is definitely something that folks can do. So yeah, and just if there's other ways you want to say.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I believe it's in my name at the Greene BJ. You can subscribe to my Substack where I occasionally post. I'm trying to post more. I also I support FAIR. I mean, FAIR. They're doing a constant need of funding because independent media isn't cheap. Um, yeah, go find independent media. Go support independent media and fight the good fight.
Right on. Absolutely. All right, I'm going to take us out of here, everybody. Thank you so much.